Honourable Ministers, Secretary General of the CTU, distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to be here this morning to talk, I think, on a much more serene topic of sovereign cloud and how it supports innovation, governance and sustainability in the Caribbean. In this panel, we hope that we will be addressing how and why the concept of sovereign cloud is becoming a central prerequisite to sustainable digital transformation, and how it can be a catalyst for innovation and development of the digital economy. But before I go into that, I'd like to introduce the panel. And first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Eamonn Sheehy, and I'm the Director of Public Sector of Cloud Carib. Cloud Carib is a managed services provider here in the region. We have our own cloud infrastructure here in Barbados, in Jamaica, and in the Bahamas, as well as some countries in Latin America. Secondly, unfortunately not yet appearing on the screen, but I would like to introduce Mr. Richard de Moser, Director of Cloud Sales, Strategy and Planning of VMware. So I'm just going to wait to see if, because he's calling in on Zoom, and there he is. So this is Richard de Moser, Director of Cloud Sales for VMware. And of course, I guess all of you are aware of VMware, the company, central to the development of cloud computing and the growth of cloud computing. Also joining us via Zoom is Mr. Carlos Oliveira, Principal Administrator of D3 Policy Outreach and International Affairs of the European Commission's DG Connect. DG Connect is the Directorate General for Communications, Networks, Content and Technology. And its role is to develop and carry out the European Commission's policy on the digital economy and society, and conduct research and innovation. And here on the stage with me, we have Mr. Bartlett Morgan, lawyer at Bloomfield Caribbean, with specialization in digital law. So let us start perhaps with the first question to Carlos. From my interpretation of what is going on in the European Union, we can see three aspects to their strategy. One relates to GDPR, the second relates to digital sovereignty, and then of course the digital economy. And I think these three aspects can equate to let's say the title of this session, equating to innovation, governance, and sustainability. So Carlos, can you provide the context and thinking behind these aspects and where sovereign cloud fits into this strategy, particularly with emphasis on the innovation, governance, and sustainability aspects? I'm afraid we cannot hear you. Is on mute. Unmute. No, we still can't hear you.
Is it now better?
Yes, that's very good. Very
okay. Good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's really for me a great pleasure to participate in this conversation. And I hope that from our experience at the European Union, we can provide some sources of inspiration for what Caribbean can achieve, very much in line of some of the statements made by precedent speakers. And let me perhaps start by giving a very short outlook about why, for instance, data protection plays such an important role. Because data protection, beyond its intrinsic value, as a tool to secure our private information, is also something that plays a role in the broader building or edifice of data economy. I mean, data protection, as most of you certainly are aware of, is something that actually dates from the beginning of the or the end of the first decade of the 21st century. And what we have learned from our previous engagement is that indeed this provides a very insightful perspective about what can be achieved in different areas. More specifically, just to give, let's say, a few snapshots, what we are doing is on one side very much anchored on an overall perspective about how the society should work. Indeed, the data protection is something that is inscribed in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, but at the same time, it's also something that derives from the need to really create a framework for regulation of this information that becomes not an obstacle to the development of the data economy, but instead a facilitator, because to some extent we are trying to provide, especially in the context of the European Union, harmonized perspective about what is the rules applicable to this sector. At the same time, it provides a governance structure that affords a framework to enforce not only the rights but also the sanctions for the use of or the misuse of data. And in this context, for instance, we believe that we can expect a reduction of the costs of conformity that is very significant compared to what we could get if we have a devised market. And at the same time, a greater coherence. One of the things that we could observe in some countries in Latin America is that indeed not only the decision was the decision of aligning with legislation that was very much aligned with the same principles of the GDPR, was not only supported by the civil society, but also very much endorsed by the businesses and the industry in general. At the same time, what we are aiming at plays a very strong role in associated sectors. And when we talk about a convergence, a regulatory convergence around data protection, we're also envisaging measures that facilitate in the future a free flow of data, certainly of data protection, of personal data, when the protective measures are considered adequate and somehow equivalent across the different states that are involved, but also of non-personal data. Of course, you can ask me how this is relevant for the development of cloud. Well, in reality, if we want to have a situation where different member states or different countries can ensure that they can secure personal data in a way that is compatible with these common obligations or with this element of equivalence, it's very important that they have control of what is the main mechanism for storage of data. It doesn't need to translate into necessarily a localization requirement, but we recognize that localization in many instances can be a very effective tool to ensure such kind of compliance with the general rules. Let me come back a little bit to the issue that was raised a bit earlier regarding the regulatory framework for data economy. I mean, of course, I think that the examples about the impact of the economic impact of the data economy abound, and I'm not going to repeat the many figures that are available, even if some of them are, let's say, quite impressive. We are talking about just in terms of additional added value of for the European Union of something around the 300 billion euros, which is quite a significant figure. This is just as additional value. But what is also very important to enable this is to have a harmonized regulatory framework. I'll perhaps stop here and come back to this at a later stage if you think that is appropriate.
Thank you, Carlos. So I will come back to this, and I will come back to Bartlett on this, but I first want to bring in Richard from VMware. You may be aware that VMware has a sovereign cloud initiative and a sovereign cloud framework. And I would like to ask Richard, what's the driving force behind establishing VMware's sovereign cloud initiative?
Thank you, Eamonn. First of all, thank you, and good morning to everybody in the room. It's a big pleasure to speak to you. Hopefully, you can hear me all. And thank you for giving us the space here to speak about the Sovereign Cloud Initiative. As a European citizen, I'm a big fan of what the European Union is doing, especially with the European Commission as well as DG Connect, and the ideas that they actually drive into policies and regulations. Now, when we started our Sovereign Cloud Initiative, it actually started with the European Data Act, which tried to harvest and monetize the value of data collected through cutting-edge technologies. First and foremost, 3G or 5G technologies, IoT, and then the vast amount of data going to be collected. Based on that, there was a non-profit organization then created. It was called GaiaX, who then started to develop a open framework, a platform, a reference architecture for European enterprises, companies, as well as cloud providers to freely exchange data in an open fashion, transparent and fair fashion. And also, create then some kind of a marketplace to exchange data and then drive innovation. And Carlos just mentioned it, the added on value for the next couple of years is about 300 billion euros. So this is significant. Now, VMware in early 2021 started to engage in the GaiaX non-profit organization as a sponsor. And then we thought, well, we see absolute big value. It's all about the data, customers' data, consumers' data, enterprises' data. Now, how can we actually complement this valuable strategy from the European Union? And since they focused on the data layer, we said, well, we actually come up from the bottom, from an infrastructure perspective. So then we said, okay, let's define like an open framework where we then just bake in the principles that have been defined by the European Union into our framework and try to foster that, drive that, encourage our partners to pick up on those, basic principles, and then, give them the opportunity to host those data exchange marketplaces. I think, that was really like, the first ignition of where we started to engage. We then, started to move on with the Sovereign Cloud Initiative. We defined a policy framework, and we then launched it in late 2021. At a consumer custom event called VM Explore or VM World, as it was called then. And I think that's like the background of what we try to do. Just give custom or like nations the ability to support their digital agenda with their own through their own economy.
Thank you, Richard. I've got a follow-up question on that one. Is when you develop the framework and you also now have this verified sovereign cloud partnership program, what are the characteristics that VMware will recognize as a sovereign cloud, particularly when you put your, let's say, reputation as a company with a company name on the VMware verified sovereign cloud partner? What are those partners expected to have, the characteristics they're expected to have?
Okay, thank you. I think that's a really good question, Eamonn. So first of all, when we started our thought process, there was no official definition of what is a data sovereignty or sovereign cloud, and still the European Commission unfortunately does not define it. Now we then sit down and put pen to paper and noted then, okay, first of all, we think all data needs to be resident within a territory, and a territory can be a country, but it can also be like a legal boundary. So some certain US states, could define an individual state, or we could have a NATO or European Union as a territory. Secondly, with data residency, this is then super critical, and that's why we then differentiate from the big three hyperscalers in the Americas. A cloud service provider must have full jurisdictional control over the data. That means they must be registered locally in that territory, and they must guarantee then to us that they can legally protect any foreign access to that customer data. And it must be really all customer data. It's not just the workload data, which can be protected by a customer by encryption, for example, but also the metadata. There is a lot of value to derive from metadata. So we really insist that full jurisdictional control over the metadata is there from a cloud provider perspective as well. Think the Cloud Act, FISA, but then there's other nations like China, NIL, National Intelligence Law, but any other state basically does that kind of an infiltration. But then those two are really the cornerstones of full control over data. Then thirdly, we require full compliance with national legislations. And I think that's why I disagree with the former speaker, where not always national compliance is guaranteed. We ask this from our cloud service providers and partners. And then last but not least, it's about protecting the data, make it as secure as possible, but then also unlock the value of data and to drive innovation in the region.
Thank you, Richard. Bartlett, if I can turn to you now, because we've had some comments about the regulatory environment, particularly related to GDPR, and even with the sovereign cloud about data localization, etc. Can you give us a perspective of what's happening in this region regarding data privacy, data protection?
Sure. So the Caribbean is in a space right now where privacy and privacy laws are concerned, where it's almost like, as we'd say in Jamaica, river come down. So it's just a burst of activity right now. Just a few years ago, a decade ago, it was at best a handful of countries that even had privacy laws on the books. And now, as it stands, we're looking at a situation where the vast majority of Caribbean countries already have a substantive general purpose privacy law on the books. We're looking at, and this is defining Caribbean broadly, we're looking at something like 25 countries with privacy laws on the books and maybe about 8 without at this point. And there are other deeper implications for what the status is right now and what that means for business, for governments, and so on. Because, for example, what you see trend-wise is that increasingly the laws that are being passed are increasingly sophisticated in the scope of rights that are made available to data subjects and the detailed level of controls that are put in place for persons who are handling the data, different companies, and so on. And by extension, we're also seeing meaningful inroads by way of the kinds and nature of enforcement mechanisms and the size of the fines that are now available. A good example is that the last country to pass a law was Guyana. Guyana has more or less taken an approach that's similar to the Europeans via the GDPR, where you can use things like percentages of your overall profits as the basis for fines. And so we're seeing increasingly sophisticated sort of region where privacy laws are concerned. Those who've passed laws very early on, they're now looking to retool their laws or replace them altogether. I'm thinking here of the Bahamas, where they're currently going through a draft to bring up to speed their law, which was passed in like 2003. Trinidad has a law that's on the books, but not fully enforced. They're already looking to update the provisions to bring it in line with the general trends that I've just described.
Carlos, can I ask you a question, which I'm going to come back to Bartlett on straight after your answer. How important is it, or was it, for the European Union to have harmonized GDPR legislation at the bloc level? And I think obviously the question I'm going to come back to Bartlett is it a missed opportunity here in the region that we didn't operate at a regional level, but at more at the national level? So first, Carlos, how, let's say, important from the point of view of developing digital sovereignty and developing digital economy, has the GDPR been a foundation because it's at the block level?
I mean, I can say that it was a crucial element to develop this common understanding of what we mean by data protection, actually, which is has a slight distinction between data protection and privacy, but I'm not going to enter into that debate. But just as a little side comment, this actually unleashed an enormous ability to really have a better dialogue with the industry, because we are talking about entities that now running most of the digital platforms that use, in many cases, personal data as an element for their business model. This created, let's say, a capacity of dialogue and created a level playing field that we have actually been very successful in sharing with countries in other parts of the world. I don't want to put too much emphasis on my personal experience, but I spent 6 years in Brazil, during which I had the chance of actually following almost every step of the discussion about their legislation on data protection. And it became very clear that indeed the fact that there was a region with the size, number of users, also economic relevance like Europe was very important, because it created, let's say, a model that could serve as inspiration for other legislations, even not only on the issues that are very basic about sanctions and so on, but also about the things that are essential in the analysis of data protection. Things like transparency of algorithms, things like scoring, not personal scoring, but for instance, scoring for credit. Things like, for instance, what kind of data can be shared without actually infringing the rights of users and creating, let's say, a beneficial environment also for the businesses that depend on such data, because we don't want really to create, let's say, a straitjacket that doesn't allow really to develop the innovative potential of data. In many areas, such potential can be used. And for instance, during the COVID pandemic, we had actually a few examples of how we could really combine this innovative potential, this public good, with an element of data protection. So for us, we used to say that is to some extent a success story, with all these elements: protection of rights, but also creating a global point of reference for the rest of the world on this area that we hope to emulate in other areas of the data regulatory framework, with the Data Act, with the AI, with data governance, and so on, which also fit into the rules that are applicable to cloud and edge computing.
Thank you, Carlos.
Back to you.
Bartlett, could you comment on that aspect of it, the regionalization versus the, let's say, nationalization of legislation?
So yeah, the way I want to speak on it is by giving some context to data protection and privacy. Very often there is this assumption, and an incorrect assumption, that privacy is about limiting things, limiting business, making things harder and so on. All these additional controls have to put in place and what have you. But in the larger scheme of things, when done right, privacy is actually quite the business enabler at the domestic level, but also internationally. And so the degree to which you implement appropriate legal frameworks correctly is also directly correlates to the degree to which you allow business to develop and cross-border transactions and so on to take place effectively. Now, in the Caribbean context, obviously the degree to which there is an element of predictability in the legal framework that you'll find around the movement of personal data, it clearly will lead to spill-on effects for businesses in terms of efficiencies and so on, and even, quite frankly, there's the likelihood of doing business more regionally and so on, and at a certain scale. And in my view, there is, I would say right now, there's something of a missed opportunity in the sense that, yes, we all have these different privacy laws, and you heard the statistics that I gave earlier. You know, we're increasingly going that direction, but we're going about it in a sort of piecemeal fashion as it stands right now. And, you know, this, and I mean, there's perhaps an element of irony that we're speaking of sovereignty and data sovereignty, and it's absolutely within the right of a sovereign country to do what they want in terms of their laws. But the question is, in doing that, are you doing it in a way with an eye to the future? And for example, in the context where we are, well, most Caribbean countries are part and parcel of the CSME, right? And so if you're passing laws with that in mind, then the question becomes, to what degree are you creating a framework or circumstances where data can flow quickly, easily, efficiently, and I would argue predictably? And so to the extent that we pass individual laws with different nuances and so on, it actually does a disservice to that. And so if we're able to pass laws that are actually more aligned in certainly in the fundamental areas, it makes it easier to have these kinds of spill-on effects for the economy and so on.
Richard, if I can bring you in on this one, and as a global technology company, I don't know if you've got a view on an approach for legal frameworks. You're obviously a European citizen, you know all about the EU legislation, but let's say for a region like the Caribbean, which has CARICOM as one of the main regional organizations, what would be your perspective from a technology company point of view and a recommendation, let's say, on a legal approach?
I personally think, working in technology for many, many years now, as well as, for VMware, we see ourselves as an enabler in a region. And, VMware, we are a global US-based company, and, we don't want to be like, a policymaker or like an enforcer of something. We see ourselves as an enabler. And, that's the way how we actually structured now our Sovereign Cloud Initiative. We want to enable local partners who are then, the specialists to adhere and follow the local legislation. So I think, that's the first point. So, and, that also means I'm not, an expert speaker right now on, the local legislation, the CARICOM basis or, within the Caribbean. But in general, I think also there needs to be, a certain, critical mass in, for either legislation or for business that needs to be overcome in order then, to generate more value. So from that perspective, I would, probably agree with Bartlett that, defining, data privacy at a bigger scale, probably would, drive more betterment than, for the region.
Thank you, Richard.
Eamonn, am I allowed to make a little?
Sure.
Is just because it was something that actually popped up from the comments made in the meantime. We are at the moment actually engaging with some countries on the next step, which is the so-called adequacy agreements with countries with whom we have, let's say, this same level of equivalence in terms of protection, in terms of rights to users, in terms of mechanisms of implementing these. And for instance, one of the outcomes of this is that at the moment, we are moving into another service with great impact from our perspective, which is, for instance, the development of a system of mutual recognition of digital signatures, not only within the context of the European Union, but potentially going abroad, going into other countries that are our partners, and therefore with an enormous potential for economic advantages in terms of facilitating commerce, facilitating exchanges of information, and basically giving a true sense of what we usually talk about, a global digital economy, where everybody actually is in a more leveled playing field. Sorry for this interruption.
There is something I do want to sort of append to the back end of this conversation so far, and I mean we're speaking in the context of sovereignty and benefits and perhaps drawbacks or what have you of that, but we've kind of gone in the direction of data privacy, and I feel like there's a way in which the two connect, and it relates to the question that you've kind of asked. So one of the things you tend to realize with data sovereignty fairly early on is that there isn't sort of like one standard definition that everybody says, yes, this is what it means, right? Depending on the context, there are people who sort of define data sovereignty slightly differently, and it really tends to go back to the particular needs of a particular country and so on. And so very often, in the context of, questions around security and so on, there may be certain concerns or fears about the data. Not so much that it has to reside within the sovereign state itself, but that it does not go to certain other sovereign states. But there are certain other countries, you could think of them as friendly countries. And so perhaps you may want to use the same EU as a sort of example where there will be less difficulties or less security concerns around, for example, your data being stored in a jurisdiction that's close by. Now, I'm saying that to say, if you have agreements at whatever level between countries, for example, in the Caribbean context, that speak to a number of things around data sharing and certain baselines around data, and even just sort of like a recognition of each of the jurisdictions that are part to the agreement as having a certain baseline framework. These are things that, again, augur to the benefit of the Caribbean countries themselves, because, for example, there may be well-developed infrastructure in a particular country that's suitable and meets all the metrics and criteria. And based on how you define, sovereignty or your sovereignty-related needs, it's okay for you to have the data there, perhaps, right? Mm-hmm. And so there are all these different ways that this conversation could go as regards the whole question of legal arrangements and how they could potentially facilitate sovereignty. But if you've taken a broad view of it, for example, as some people have done.
So because we spoke a lot about data and data sovereignty, and obviously, whatever way you want to slice this, when you talk about sovereign cloud or digital sovereignty, it all comes back to data in the end. The use of data, monetization of data, the protection of data, all of these things, it's back to data. Carlos, can I ask you, I know that in the context of the current collegiate of the European Commission, they did place a priority on pledging that Europe must achieve technological sovereignty in critical areas. Now, I would take that as digital sovereignty in critical areas, maybe, if it means the same thing. Could you kind of give an indication of what those areas are, where the emphasis on the sovereignty is, as opposed to perhaps a more global approach?
Yes, indeed. I mean, there are several elements that are very critical in this discussion about sovereignty. One has to do with the dependency on some critical technologies. I mean, the one example that normally comes to our minds more immediately has to do with the whole area of microelectronics, where Europe, despite being probably the largest market in the world, still has a very small slice of production that is done locally. And that's not just a matter of lack of technological capacity, because in the pipeline of the semiconductor industry, there are many European companies that are global leaders, but it's also a matter of the way the production chains in the sector are organized to take profit from advantages of in economies of scale. And this is probably the most obvious area. But the notion of sovereignty also applies to other elements, how to really embark into an element of discussion regarding the issues of competition that reflects a global perspective and not just, let's say, a local market perspective, but also the issues of how the new media, and especially the role of digital platforms, have on issues such as the influence in the democratic process, but ultimately how also we envisage the future in a way that actually creates a fair level playing field. And in this context, we think that actually it's very important to really make, let's say, an assessment of what is the situation. The issues around cloud, the issues around networks and network infrastructures that ensure a secure global connectivity system or global connectivity infrastructure are very central. And that's the reason why the European Union is actually deploying very significant investments in this area, not only in Europe, but also with partner countries across the world. And for instance, the Global Gateway package that is being deployed, especially in Africa, but also in Latin America and Caribbean, makes part of this. And by saying that we are targeting these regions is not because we have any kind of neo-colonialist ambition. It's simply because these are also regions with whom we believe that we have some commonality of values and understanding about what should be the future in terms of project of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Richard, I saw you nodding your head there during that comment. Do you have a comment to make on this?
No, absolutely. I could not, agree more. What Carlos just said. From my perspective, is really coming down a lot, to competitive advantage by some global players, that have such a big, step ahead. Like 80% of European data, resides with American and US-based companies. That is an incredible amount, and if you just look into this competitive advantage, those three companies know almost every single step, what users and enterprises are doing today and what they actually want to do the next 12 to 18 months. And using that, advantage or, that knowledge to their own advantage. They're not open, they're not sharing. And then, local economies or local enterprises will never have a chance, to really play a true catch up. So from that perspective, spot on, Carlos.
Let's say turning to something a little bit more mundane, which is the economic possibilities here in the Caribbean. I know for Carlos, we have a CARIFORUM EU Economic Partnership Agreement, and in that agreement, services are covered, including ICT services. And of course, Europe is a very large market, 450 million people, and you mentioned already about the added value of 300 billion on cloud computing. How should the Caribbean approach gaining access to this market? I mean, we've had this offline discussion before, and it does kind of come back to certain aspects of the regulatory environment, the levels of data protection for EU citizen data being hosted in the region. What is the potential, and are there steps that would allow the region to gain access to this very large market?
Well, I think that it could seek inspiration about what is already taking place with other parts of the world, because to some extent, the digital transformation that we are going through is a bit of a redistribution of the cards. We don't necessarily need to really go through the same process of following the steps of the others, possibly normally seen as more developed countries or more advanced countries, to repeat the same learning process. We can overcome some of these intermediate steps and get to the point more quickly without this lengthy learning curve. And what we have seen is that from our contacts with some countries, the fact that we have been able to really create this kind of common regulatory environment, that we have been able to attract the investment of companies, including many European companies that are actually active in the sector. It is really important because it creates this kind of fair and more equitable market competition that allows us to benefit from innovation, to create new opportunities. And when I say new opportunities not only for European companies, but also for the companies and the actors in Caribbean to really accede to the European market. Is a two-way street, and we believe that actually there is a huge potential in this area, even to capitalize on services that are not yet fully deployed, but where you can have some local advantages that can be explored. provided that we create this environment that allows the free flow of data, not only personal data, but also other kinds of data that are essential and where you have probably in some areas good advantages. The developments around 5G, IoT are not simply technological developments. They have really a huge impact in transforming the business models of traditional activities. And that's really an opportunity. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Bartlett, you want to make a comment on that? Okay, so I think we just have one final question on this panel before we open it for any questions from the audience. And it's a fairly simple one, I guess. If you were asked to advise the governments here in the Caribbean represented at the CTU event on implementing sovereign cloud, what would your key message be? And I'll go to Richard first.
Okay, all right, thank you, Ian. I think, with a sovereign cloud, everybody thinks about security, and security comes down to, protect, unauthorized access to data. Everybody thinks about security controls and malicious users and ransomware attacks, etc. But there is the other aspect of the jurisdictional control, where third jurisdictions actually can bypass national legislation to gain access to customer data, metadata as well as customer data. So my recommendation would be really on a regional level, start to think about the data sovereignty and put it on the digital agenda of CARICOM, and then really start to define that term. What is data sovereignty? What does it mean? Because the global hyperscalers start to use that term, but they dilute the value of it. And by our definition, they never can be data sovereign. So that would be the first thing. Think, put it on the agenda. Then start to put in place legislation, with that definition in there. And then thirdly, Bartlett spoke about that one as well. Enforce it. So just don't create a paper tiger. Really enforce it. Think about how you think structure then penalties.
Thank you, Richard. Carlos, what would your advice be to governments here today?
I mean, I have to admit that I feel inclined to look at if you allow me, the bigger picture. When I say the bigger picture is looking, of course, to the cloud as an important, I would even say in some respects, essential component of a broader investment that covers what we define in our Digital Compass 2030 strategy, the key elements of the four quadrants. The investment on infrastructures that has to do with connectivity, but also other kinds of infrastructure that are essential. That's where we have precisely edge and cloud computing. We are also talking about using this infrastructure basis to promote the digitization both of government but of services, because that also fits into this idea of actually reaping the benefits of the digital transformation. But of course, this doesn't really work if you don't have the human skills to really explore fully this potential. And we talk about skills, we are not only talking about the professionals, even if they are extremely important, but also about the population in general, because the population has to be, let's say, equipped to really unleash all the potential. It could be in terms of entrepreneurship, even of small businesses. It could be in terms of explore, I mean, in many areas where at the moment the traditional value chains really are made in such a way that in many cases only a very small part of the value that is generated in a value chain stays in the place where the thing is produced and ultimately gets a bit lost in the long chain with other intervenients. And I think this is very important to Caribbean, where I think that you have probably experienced this same problem. lots of products, lots of even services, where ultimately you get 20% and the other 80% are lost in other intervenients. Having this understanding is very important and will really be crucial to really push to a more equitable distribution of the value that is generated by the digital transformation.
Thank you, Carlos. And finally, Bartlett, what would your advice to the governments here be?
I think my advice would perhaps be in two categories. One, collective action, and the second is really more of a question, why? As regards the first, I think we're at the point now where, I mean, we've seen the evidence from other places in the world, Europe and elsewhere, where taking a collective approach to figuring out issues around digital and data sovereignty, it holds the potential for unlocking tremendous amount of economic value. There's no reason why we can't do the same. I think what's going to be important for us is to sit down and do the hard work of figuring out, well, first of all, what do some of these things actually mean to us, these concepts? You know, figure out what they mean, figure out a collective baseline that we can all agree on, and then figure out different ways in which we can tackle it in a way that makes sense for us as a region. It's, you know, it's critical as we enter this latest era of the Caribbean's development that we are mindful that digital development and the development of our digital economies individually and collectively is where it's at. And so we need to put in place the building blocks for that for right now. And I feel like that's where, for example, those of, you know, ministers and so on who are here need to start having those smaller conversations about how do we get it right so we don't get down the road in a piecemeal way and then try to figure it out and try to like pull it back on the back end when it's sometimes impossible to do. The other, I think, takeaway, I think, for, you know, different jurisdictions in the Caribbean who may be represented here today is the whole question of why. As it stands right now, I mean, tackling questions or trying to figure out issues around digital sovereignty and data sovereignty in particular, I think you need to know, well, why? Why is it important at the level of a government, but also within your government, within different ministries and departments and so on? There needs to be a meaningful engagement with the question of, well, why? Why are we doing this? Why are we going after this or tackling this issue of data sovereignty? What are the particular drivers for us? And that will tend to sort of inform the appropriate solutions that make sense for you. Don't make the mistake that we've sometimes made in the past where we call up somebody else in a similar department or ministry or even country and go, well, what did you guys do? Okay, all right, we'll do that too. That doesn't work. We've seen that it doesn't work. There is enough nuance at play for us to be, to have to be mindful of our specific situations and so on. I think that's where I'd end today.
Thank you very much, Bartlett. Well, we've got a few minutes left, so I'd open the floor for anybody with questions. I'll count to 5, and if I don't see a hand up, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, well, one gentleman just got in before I saw Gary telling me to wrap it up. So there might be one question then. You're the lucky man.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Thank you. This is Felipe de la Mota from the European Union delegation here in Barbados. I just wanted to mention, because in this context, we're going to be having in the EU-LAC Digital Alliance an event in Cartagena, the Indias, at the end of November, where we're going to be inviting senior officials of all the Caribbean governments for discussion with the EU on policy dialogue precisely in the area of data governance. But not just that, artificial intelligence, also connectivity and the broader digital debate. So I just wanted to let participants know, particularly from the governments, that we're going to be inviting you to this discussion with you officials later in November. Just a plug-in.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think with that then we will wrap up. Everybody needs to have a coffee and a tea. And I would just like to thank the panelists, Bartlett here in Barbados, Richard in Munich, and Carlos in Brussels. Thank you very much. This panel is now concluded.